And it is 7:03 and you're live.
All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the City of Oneonta Planning Commission regular meeting. Clerk, could you please call the roll of members?
Chair Lappin,
Right here.
Vice Chair Overby,
Here.
Commissioner Maskin is absent. Commissioner Stanton,
Awesome.
Commissioner Thomas,
Here.
Commissioner Dygan,
Here.
Councilmember Risberger.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great, thank you so much. So first on the agenda is the review of the March minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments about them? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the March minutes as presented?
I'll make a motion. We approve.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
So motion made by Commissioner Thomas, seconded by Commissioner Dygan. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. Next on the agenda is the review of the MU1 zoning district regulations. I understand that Steve Yearly sent out the sign section, which is the last remaining section that needs to be done. So Steve, do you want to just give a quick overview of it and then a quick overview of the next steps related to the MU1 code?
So the overview of the sign code is essentially what I did was I went through, there was this court case called Reed versus Gilbert that basically determined that signage that is not content neutral is essentially a violation of speech. So basically, if you regulate signs, long story short, if you regulate signs by saying a sign can be, you can have a business sign, but you can't have a sign that says, I love cats. That's essentially a violation of free speech. So what I did was I basically reworked our code sections to reflect like a content neutral. So content neutral basically says location, number, size. It can't have anything to do with content. So even some of the signage that has like names like address sign, basically what it is it's just reflecting size and location. So you could have a business sign downtown that says, I don't know, I love cats. And that would be fine. Because the minute that we restrict signage based on content, we're facing essentially a challenge, like a lawsuit. So really what the updated sign code reflects is a move towards signage that is basically restricts size and location, not content. Even off premises, like restricting off premises signing or signage is kind of, it's like fresh for the it's like ripe for challenge, because the minute you say you can't have a sign for a McDonald's, but you can't have a sign for Latte Lounge, like on that same building, the challenge then comes, well, the only reason you can know it's off-site or off-premise advertising is by reading it. So I pretty much have just removed anything from our sign code that regulate signage based on content. We also had a weird thing in our code where we allow all kinds of like LED, LCD, digital, video, image, message changing signage. That's something that you guys, if you have an opinion on, you can share. My take on it was we kind of cited in our comprehensive plan that we're trying to rework Main Street into a more to better reflect the historic downtown that we have. Based on what we've seen as far as digital signage is concerned, it hasn't been great. I believe it would be wise to move away from that type of signage. It's obviously something we can change if you guys disagree. The other thing I did was the sign types are basically listed. Like you can look at them and they're like, there's a blade sign, there's a wall sign, we actually expanded the number of sign types in this code. So instead of just being restricted to a wall sign or a blade sign, we've added a lot of additional sign types you can put on a building. And then I added some images of like how you could theoretically organize all those sign types into like a pretty cohesive, visual. So that's kind of the intent of the sign section of the code, is basically reducing the amount of like kind of digital clutter and kind of some of the signage clutter we have going on. And just kind of, I would say, upping the bar a little bit on what we allow. The other thing I took out, the temporary vinyl signage, like the banner type signage, restricting that to like a more definitive time period. We have all kinds of businesses that kind of just throw up these weird banner signs that they just kind of nail to the front of the building. I think restricting those to like a 30-day period is beneficial, because we have some businesses that literally open and close with those banner signs up. So yeah, it's basically just an update on what we kind of already have going, and it kind of organizes it a little better, I think. But obviously it's up to you guys to, if you have feedback, if you think I'm crazy, if you're, it's all open.
I did have one suggested edit under the section where it says standards under 1B. It says convey the sense of excitement and vitality envisioned downtown Oneonta, but I was just wondering if you meant by or throughout downtown Oneonta.
Let me get. Oh, yep. Nice catch.
Thank you. Yeah, so
I try to copy edit these as much as I can, but sometimes I end up just staring at it for so long that I'll just kind of. I probably read this thing like 18 times through from start to finish, so I just starts to swamp together a little bit.
Yeah, of course. Once you go through it enough times, it becomes.
You start adding words that you like. If you misspelled or missed, you just like kind of like, okay, read.
Stephen, I thank you for putting that together, and the image you had with all the different types of signs was helpful, because I don't really know what different types are called, so that was helpful. I guess with the digital signs, the first thing that comes to my mind is the NBT Bank sign that has like the weather, I think. I guess my question would be, why? Can you just re-elaborate why we want to discourage that or prohibit that?
So it's not specifically that sign. I think that sign is okay. I think though what we've seen outside of that sign though is like the currently the one that was installed in front of the Art Foothills. I think we've got a couple other ones floating around on Main Street that are. If you look at like the tattoo shops and stuff, they have like these scrolling, flashing LED like come here that repeatedly flash and scroll. And I think it kind of goes back to there are probably tasteful digital signs, and I think you're right. The one at 189 Main isn't overly offensive. I think it becomes challenging to figure out how to restrict or how to review some digital signs against other digital signs.
I was talking about the one on Chestnut, but 189, that's a good one too. Yeah.
Okay, I'm drawing a blank. I've probably gone by it a million times.
It's at a sign over Otsego now.
I know what you're talking about, Danny. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't-
I was
don't we
talking
have
about,
a
I think MBT
prohibition
has one. with
against,
the-
animated signs now. In other words, they can only change once every 2 minutes, or I believe it, the way the code's written now. Isn't that true?
The current code allows any, I mean, it specifically allows any type of LED, LCD, animated signage anywhere downtown.
Well, I think we can address your problem with the sign, with the flashing signs and the change and have the arrows and all that, just by writing it in such a way that the sign can't change more frequently than, say, once every 2 minutes, something like that. One of the first of these LED signs to go up was over at Legends, I think it was called at the time, the bar over on the corner of across the street from the service, the city service center, where the police and firemen are. It was called the filling station for a while, and it was called Legends. I don't know what the name of it is now. Anyway, they had one of the first ones at that corner, and the state made them wouldn't allow them to have animation because it's on a state highway. And so, you know, we might have it may be that the state law solves the problem. I don't know. Because 7 runs right down Main Street, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I guess I just wouldn't want to discourage the good types of sign with the blanket prohibition on LED signage.
I agree with Shane.
yeah, I mean, that's so I think what we're going to run into is assuming that the CLG program goes through, I think you're going to have a hard sell for LED signs anyway downtown. I think that'll effectively, because those will have to be reviewed for basically, like, are they consistent with the historic, you know, the material, context of the downtown. Typically those are pretty much booted. So, I mean, we can add LED and LCD signs in. We could make them follow the same requirements as any other type of wall sign and just not remove. We could remove the limitation on LED, LCDs and just have them governed as just like any other sign of that type. So basically you could say, you can have an LED wall sign. It has to meet the same standards as any other wall sign. You know, it can be that size, that location, that.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, I think you could probably make it to where that it would have to pass muster with SHPO, since the Main Street is a historic district. And so it's been, this passage of the CLG resolution would indicate that we as a city place a pretty high value on the historic character of Main Street. And so I think that we have to be careful. I don't know. I mean, personally, I have a slightly different perspective. I'd be willing to kind of hear what everybody has to say. I think that excluding LED signs from Main Street will still leaves large portions of the city open to have them, or the MU1. And I think that either way, if there is an LED sign proposed, it should go before the commission for review as part of, especially if we were to adopt the form-based code.
So I mean, one of the benefits of doing the zoning code the way we've done it with the Transix is we can we can theoretically limit LED signage and LCD signage to, Main Street, because they would have to comply with SHPO in order, there'd be that layer of review because of the CLG. The other Transex sections, so you've got, 4 and 5, so you basically have Market Street and the neighborhood behind Main Street. I mean, theoretically, you could allow that type of signage on Market Street easily, because we've kind of subdivided the MU1 zone. Or you could just make them require, some sort of some sort of site plan review or something. I mean, you could trigger if it involves LED, LCD, or animated signage to, have to do. But the only thing I think you might run into with that is limiting. I would be interested to see if you can limit, if you can allow one type of sign and then require, well, I guess you could do that. You could argue that because of the LED, LCD element, that it's a different medium, it's a different, intensity than maybe a painted sign or just a backlit sign. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's up to you guys. I'm open to, yeah, I mean, we like I said, in theory, we could just regulate signage and say an LED sign has to meet the same standards as any other sign.
Yeah, I think that would be my preference too.
Danny,
That sounds good.
Danny.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
I think when I think about the LED signs, number one, that's probably one of the biggest complaints I've heard over the last few years about those signs, whether they're on Main Street or the one that's in front of Foothills was up less than a week, and I had somebody call me and say it was incredibly obnoxious at night. For me, though, it really, the most important thing is, does this follow along with what we have in the comprehensive plan, and what are our goals for our Main Street? And I would have to agree with Stephen on this. I think whatever we can do to limit that type of sign on Main Street would be a good thing, especially if we're looking to expand our historic districts and we're looking for a particular look, I guess, downtown. And right now there's, the 189 Main Street sign, I don't mind. The one that's near the bank coming off Chestnut Street, I think is fine. But there's a few other ones that are really obnoxious, and I put those and those banners on the sides of the buildings in the same category. I think it's not really giving us what we're looking for Main Street that's really going to attract people downtown. So I think we need to consider what's in the comprehensive plan, what our goals are when we're considering this.
I mean, one option is we allow static signs, LED, LCD signs, but they just have to be static. I mean, it's a lot of other communities have dealt with this particular type of sign. So there are ways to do it. Like Ed was saying, we can restrict the the amount of time that an image or piece of sign copies on the sign. You can restrict them that they can't be animated at all, that they can only be static. I mean, you can restrict them to how much light they put off. I mean, ultimately it just comes down to, if the Bombers sign was LED, LCD, even if it was static, like what does that end up looking like? Because ultimately, if we're restricting them to, the requirements of the other sign types, what do you end up with the 25 foot by 4 foot high, bomber sign that's illuminated like that. So, I mean, that would be, because even if you restrict the amount of, the amount of light, they still are, I mean, it's just a different feel. So that's just kind of what, that's kind of where I was coming from. But ultimately this will, I mean, we can go any way we want with it. So yeah, it's whatever version we want to put in front of the council.
So, what do we think?
I still tend to think we should regulate them like any other sign. That's just my opinion.
I still agree with Shane.
Commissioner Stanton or Commissioner Thomas, what do you guys think?
Yes, I'd like to see them regulated, but I agree with Dave Risberger. I don't want to see us take away from what the look we're trying to achieve on Main Street. So as long as we can regulate it somehow and it's not too offensive.
Can I break in now? My audio's been off.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Stanton.
I don't think, let me ask it in the form of a question. What benefit is there to putting these signs on Main Street? How does it help the city? That's my question. I think it detracts, and I don't see that in any way that it helps us. Everybody has a sign that can be read. So I'm against it.
Stephen, can I ask you a question? Sorry,
Yep.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Robert.
It's okay.
My question would just be, for any sign, the procedure is whenever you're seeking a sign permit, which my understanding is if you open a business, right, based on this code, you want to have a sign, doesn't matter if it's LED or whatever, or a
Right.
regular old sign, you're still going to have that sign plan, right? And that's still going to have to be reviewed by us, or is that just by your office?
So what would happen is, it's going to kind of depend. If you're on Main Street, you're going to have to go in front of the, assuming the CLG thing goes through, you will have to go in front of the Historic Preservation Board, and they would make a determination as to whether the sign you're requesting meets the intent of the historic district. So I think to answer your question, Shane, I think that our Main Street will be fairly restricted because of that, as far as LED, LCD signage is concerned. Outside of Main Street or the historic district, the idea of this code is that if you bring me a sign permit that meets this code exactly, it's just approved. I mean, it would be by right. If you have a building that you're like, I want to put up 7 signs, that's going to go in front of the planning commission, because then you guys will make a discretionary determination as to whether that sign layout meets the intent of the code. Because all the code office does is we make determinations based on, is the sign 20 feet wide? Check. Is the sign less than 5 feet high or whatever? Check. We don't make determinations on the code. So once you're like, do your 4 signs that you're requesting to be put up meet the intent of the code? That's when the planning commission reviews it and says, yeah, this is complementary to the architectural features. You guys approve like a plan, essentially. So the answer would be, on a one-off sign permit that meets the code, I'm checking that all day, because it's set up in the code. That's why we established this whole form thing, so that it's very clear what is and is not okay.
Right.
Once you get into where there's discretionary determinations based on, 4 different signs and maybe you have 6 tenants in a building, so they each have their own sign. That's where you get into making a sign plan that you guys would review. So the idea is that as you get more complex, as there's more interpretation required or more discretionary determinations about what is the intent of the code, that's where you guys are making decisions. Whereas my office is just making the, latte lounge is like, we want to change our sign. They bring me in a sign permit application. I go, yep, it meets the definition of a wall sign. It meets the size. It meets the whatever. You install it.
Okay, so lighted signs are permitted, right?
Correct.
And we have light restrictions, the light emission restrictions on the LED signs. And with those restrictions in place, it's really hard to tell an LED, LCD sign from any other static sign, as long as it's static. It seems to me that the issue is static versus animated.
And that could be something we decide makes sense to restrict. We might decide that
if that bomber's sign is offensive, it'll be offensive whether it's backlighted by LED or front lighted with incandescent.
Right. Yep. And that's totally within. That's why you guys are reviewing this, because I just put together something that I said, here, this is what, this is, I think, the direction we're trying to go. And that's why we have these meetings to kind of parse out where we're not all on the same page. And I'm somewhat neutral on this because, like I said, I think the main street is going to be restricted no matter what. I think it would be very tricky to approve an LED LCD sign in a historic district that was anything other than pretty much a static sign that just happened to be a screen instead of a painted board. It's probably possible. I would be surprised.
So this new transit center, is that, sorry, go ahead.
Dave had his hand, Commissioner Risberg had his hand up.
Thanks. Stephen, I think you brought up a good point about the historic district. What I'm thinking about too is we don't know how large the current historic districts are going to be after the studies are done. We also don't know how many historic districts we're going to have downtown. So this could be a moot point. And it could be that we look to limit digital signs on Main Street and allow them everywhere else, but then we end up having a historic board making the decisions later on about whether it fits in with the historic nature of that district. And we're gonna have a conflict. So I'm not sure which way we want to go with this. I would still lean toward what Stephen presented because of that, unless we can somehow come and revisit this later on.
So, I think that there's Councilman Risberger brings up a really good point. The historic review boards that will be established, or the board that will be established by the CLG local law, it's likely that, he is right. It could be a moot point, our discussion on LED signs, whether or not we allow them or not. So that's something that we have to consider as well. And then another thing to be aware of is that if in fact we are receiving quite a few use variance requests for LED signs, that would indicate a problem with the sign ordinance as presented. So when you adopt a new zoning amendment or zone change, and you're seeing a lot of variance requests from the public, that usually indicates that there's some hardship being experienced on their part. And so that could
agree with that, Danny. I think it's sometimes people want to apply for, everybody has a right to apply for a variance. It doesn't mean that there's a problem with a law necessarily. We've had that discussion for quite a few years, just about the nature of my ward and the application of variances for student housing.
Right, yeah, but then but then the thing about zoning by variance is that it creates exceptions to the zoning law, and it also runs with the land in perpetuity. So usually,
And that.
yeah, so my perspective would be, maybe I could rephrase it, I'd rather change the zoning law than give a lot of parcels exceptions to the zoning law. So that way we still maintain the law's integrity overall. Think of it as like a layer of armor, and the variance being a chink in the armor. So if we want to continue to revisit the sign ordinance, I know that Commissioner Overby or Vice Chair Overby has a time constraint of 8 o'clock, and we do have a subdivision application. Shouldn't take long. Do we want to proceed? And we should note that even if we advance the form-based code to the legislative committee, there will be still opportunity to review and make amendments. Because my understanding is that the council will then comment to the legislative committee, and the full council will comment, and then there will be a whole public review process in which we can go back and revisit the entire ordinance. So we still have plenty of time. And so I kind of want to be sensitive to Steve's work on the ordinance, and maybe we can discuss advancing it, but we can agree to pay more attention to the sign ordinance and continue to make comments on it all the way through the review process. What do you guys think?
Makes sense. I think it makes sense.
How would our back and forth get transmitted to Common Council? Will it be incorporated in the resolution, or how do we do that?
So I guess the way I would see it is, because I would take this to the legislative board. They're going to discuss it, the legislative committee. We can note anything that I could include in the draft that, we've had a discussion on signage, and these are the places we've kind of come to, and request that the legislative committee give us feedback on those sections.
Yeah, we can do that. And then if we want our comments noted in any, as part of the official record, you could just CC the clerk of the board, Carrie, and include her on, and just say, I'd like this added to the record surrounding discussions on the form-based code. So that way it's part of the official record when we're considering when the city is considering the zone change for adoption. So there, I think that it would just be important to note that you want your comments added to the record, or you could CC Councilman Risberger and let him know. Either way, it would be good to have a steady stream of communication going between the council and the commission concerning this law, since we've all now spent so much time reviewing it.
Excuse me, but let me understand this. We're going to come up with a recommendation. That's what the goal is for tonight. Is that correct? I would like to put my opinion in then as part of a recommendation that I don't think LED or LCD signs fit in with the historical character of Main Street. And it will, in my opinion, it'll deteriorate the quality of the street. That's it. Over.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Stanton. So do we feel like we're ready to advance the code to the legislative committee?
Real quick, Shane had a question.
So go ahead, Shane. Sorry about that.
I just wanted to bring up the other part of the code quickly, if I may, not the sign section, if we're going to be voting on recommending the whole code tonight? Is that okay, Danny?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Okay. Just one, Stephen, you responded and clarified all my questions, and it looks great to me. The one thing I still was, there's 2 points that I think we may be worth discussing, and one of them is the maximum story height in the T6 zone, or T6 transect rather. It's currently 5. I recommended that it be raised to 6 or 7. And then the other one was the permitted uses in transect 4. I just had it in front of me and then I took it away. Transect 4, where we banned or prohibited rather fraternities and sororities. And I guess my comment on that would be, don't we want to encourage them to be downtown and away from the more residential areas? So those are my 2 remaining sort of questions about the rest of the code.
Yeah, I mean, so I am not opposed to fraternity and sorority uses there. I think that arguably they probably don't have or would have the same impact as theoretically any type of housing that's high density, multifamily. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those examples of things we would probably seek legislative input on. I left that. So if you look, I think I took it out of the T6 and T5 zone, like the district there, but I left it in that T3 area, with the idea that the T3 acts as like a buffering between the adjoining neighborhood. So yeah, I mean, like, I don't have a problem with including fraternities in that transect zone. It's one of those things I think we could request the legislative, the legislative board look at it. I think it's as much political as it would be a planning exercise. I don't know what the public feedback on that would be. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's
Okay, maybe we just like the lighting. We just have, maybe that's just Shane's comment. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that is something that personally I don't have a problem with. But I think it's going to be one of those kind of like bartering chips, maybe. The height restriction in the T6 zone. Again, I don't know if you're going to be able to convince a historic review board that building a taller building in that historic section is going to ever fly. Also, just to note, the tallest building on Main Street right now is the Oneonta Hotel, and it's 5 stories. With the height of each floor on those buildings, you could exceed what the Oneonta Hotel is now, just because it doesn't maximize the height, the separate story heights. Most of the buildings on Main Street are, between 2 and 3 stories. So even now we're not, you could theoretically add additional stories to those buildings if you could get someone to approve it. So that was kind of my thought process, is that, I mean, I don't know, like Danny said, I mean, maybe in 5 years, if we have developers coming to us saying, we need an area variance because we want to exceed the 5-story height, the 5 stories, and, they can convince the historic board and it all looks great. I mean, maybe we address it then. Maybe we come back and we say, we really undersold ourselves on this code and we need to, increase the heights. But that was just kind of my thought. I mean, being that we don't have buildings currently maxing those out, my thought was, well, does it make sense to have a 7-story building if we don't even have 5-story buildings uniformly? But, I mean, that's again, it's kind of up to you guys. I mean, if people have a really strong opinion about the height thing, I can change it.
I think that maybe we could include that as a comment for the council to consider. Because I think that the hype, the height thing is something that worthy of further debate. But I think in light of all the projects coming in, I think it would and the new development occurring, I think it'd be worth moving the review process along because we're still, like I said, we're still in the very, very first stage. There's gonna be many more chances to look at it. So do we feel, do we want to continue? So I guess then I look for a motion to move the form-based code to the legislative committee for review.
Councilmember Risper has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yep, Dave, go ahead.
Well, it's probably, it doesn't matter at this point because I was thinking as far as the floor heights or the floors allowed, what are we looking to gain from it besides the floor? But what does the city gain from allowing 6 or 7 floors versus 5? But I guess I kind of answered my own question. It may bring a developer in, but
I mean,
it'll be changed later if we need to.
So I think in response to that, I mean, I agree with Shane. I mean, what we see with more concentrated, more stories leads to more people live downtown, and theoretically more people are then shopping at businesses and, doing all the stuff we want people to do downtown. The problem, the brick wall I hit with the height thing, our Main Street kind of cuts these two zones in half. So you end up with this T6 zone, which is theoretically our most concentrated zone, running right down the middle. And then you have what is clearly kind of a transitional neighborhood on one side, where you have like Kano, Petrobono's funeral home, more like low density kind of transitional buildings. On the other side, you have Market Street, which is, I mean, I want to say like kind of the Wild West. I mean, you've got all kinds of weird mix of 1-story, 2-story, Clarion, suburban type development. It's really kind of the Wild West over there. And it's really, you could theoretically throw maybe like 5 and 7-story buildings over there. It's just determining like, how do we want to, do we want to develop Market Street, theoretically, if all the cards play out, into a realm of 5 to 10-story buildings, or do we want it to kind of blend with the downtown that we have that probably, I mean, I don't think we're going to add stories to historic buildings. I don't see that happening. I know that it did happen in Saratoga. So that's kind of why I don't want to say I compromise with myself, but I kind of compromise with myself and saying, maybe in 5 years, if we see that there's a really big demand for that type of building height, we can always adjust it. But for me right now, looking at it, I just, I mean, Los Undites came in with a 4-story project. They could have built a 10-story project if they wanted to. Right now, we have no height restriction downtown. My goal was to avoid building like another Nader Towers, like a largely out of proportion, kind of poorly executed building in the middle of, 3-story single family homes, maximum 3-story single family homes. So that's kind of where I was coming from with this. So I agree with Shane. I mean, I'm not trying to I think philosophically you're absolutely correct. At the time when I drew this up and kind of presented it after reviewing our comprehensive plan, it just seemed like the most logical kind of conclusion. But no, I mean, we can forward that to the legislative committee. I'm fine with that.
I mean, that was a good, seems like a well thought out process behind that. So
I'd like to throw in one thought. The the only way we can really grow is vertically. With so many of our properties being not contributing to the tax base, if we don't go up, we can't go out sideways. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we're talking about height restrictions.
That's definitely a good point. And I think that we can certainly revisit that through the comment process. It could be that we recommend allowing taller buildings on Market Street. And then so long as they followed the design standards identified in the code. So even if we were to build vertically, the structures would still have to follow a very thorough design review process, and they'd have to fit in with Main Street. So, yeah, so what do we think?
I got another
Yeah,
question.
Shane, go ahead.
Hypothetically, if a developer came in and wanted to build a 8-story building on Market Street, or let's just say 8-story, or 6, because our max is 5. Would that be something that they could go to the planning commission through site plan review, and we could, if they made an argument that it fits within the general, I don't know, it looks good, it fits within the mission, is that something, or would that have to go to the zoning board of appeals for a variance?
The thing with that is it would be an area variance, and area variances aren't they're not reviewed to the same level of scrutiny as a use variance. So you could theoretically come to the planning commission with a site plan. The planning commission could review it and say, looks great. I mean, with the exception of it being an additional story, but overall it looks great. Everything's good. You could then write up a determination that the development meets the intent of the code, and you could send that as a recommendation to the zoning board of appeals as like as part of their application for an area variance. So like in theory, if we had developers crawling out of the woodwork being like, we just cannot build a tall enough building downtown, and we're looking at 3 area variances every building season, then yeah, I'd say we would probably at that point want to say, you know what, we've got all these guys coming, they want to build taller buildings, our code's restricting it, it's not beneficial, it's not meeting the intent of the law. We could say, yeah, let's review it, let's change it. Based on the current conditions, I mean, we could add 2 or 3 stories to most of downtown and we would still be hitting our 5-story height restriction. If you were on Market Street, I mean, I don't think there's a building down there other than the art foothills there that is even remotely, I mean, there just aren't a lot of multi-story buildings. Most of them down there are 1, 2, maybe a 3-story apartment building. Most of them aren't even close to that. I mean, you've got Sydney Federal Credit Union down there. You've got, buildings like Stella Luna's. Like they're not, they're not giant. So I think where we're at is if we had an onslaught of people that wanted to build 8-story buildings, yeah, I mean, I would say I'd be all for it. Let's change it. At this point, I don't see where that demand is. So that's kind of what I base the draft of the code on. But yeah, so to answer the question, you could get an area variance pretty easily, I would think, to do that.
Thank you.
One other thing I wanted to add that was tweaked is under the use table, detached single family homes are not permitted in the T6 and T5 zones. That's, I mean, the intent there is that you don't have someone like, I don't know, tear down Green Earth and put a single family home in.
Can I say one more thing on the
Sure,
floor
go ahead.
building height? Since it's going to be coming to the legislative committee that I'm on, I'm picturing if this group doesn't put forward some number of floors there, if you leave it ambiguous for us to decide, I feel based on what everybody's been saying that we could debate and debate and debate, and there's no really one good answer on what number of floors to include in this. And I could see that legislative committee debating forever on this. So I would appreciate if we could come forward with some number, 5, 6, 7, 8. I agree with the reasoning that Stephen has for trying to prevent another Nader Towers in the middle of a neighborhood. But I also appreciate Shane's what Shane has said about having more than 5 also. So I would say come up with a number, just stick with it.
And I think that the number currently in the code, which would probably be no taller than 189, since that's the tallest, is kind of where I am. Largely because in the many years that Onion has been in existence through boom and bust, we haven't seen an application for a building larger. The other, and that kind of lends itself, to many more debates about, what would happen in the event that we did experience such development pressure where someone did propose a multi-million-dollar 7-story building. And so I think that in the event that we do see something like that, we could amend. But I don't know if there's ever going to be such thing as a right number. Some people ask why 7? Why not 8? Why not 6? And then
Oh, excuse me.
I think we shouldn't let the hypothetical be the enemy of progress.
I could see it being the enemy in a legislative committee meeting.
Yeah, so if we just stuck with what's in the code right now, which establishes it at 5, I believe.
I tend to agree with Dave. I think we should come up with a recommendation. My recommendation would be 5 for Main Street and 8 for Market Street.
I mean, I'm not opposed to that. I think that if you guys look at the updated zoning map, we actually drew in the lofts on Dietz. So the current map actually shows the footprint of the lofts on Dietz. And to kind of go back to Shane, those questions that you sent me in the email, we went back through and we actually parceled that out. So now it ties better into the Transex. So we actually included the lofts on Dietz parcel, redrew the map. So most of what's on the backside of Main Street on the lofts on Dietz side, the Dietz Street parking lot side, is now all T4. So you could theoretically have like a division where the stuff on the Dietz lot side is in that lower, T4 category. And then the Market Street side is pretty much divided from Main Street. So in theory, you could increase the heights on the Market Street side without really affecting that much on the Dietz parking lot side. I mean, there's some outlier properties over there, so you could theoretically, see like a Wall Street parking lot, I think, would be still in the E5 section. But you could theoretically increase the heights in that T5 and kind of just focus that as like that's a potential growth spot, with Main Street staying, pretty historic, pretty static to what it is now.
Well, what if you said something like 7, but no more than 7 maximum, but no more than 2 stories higher than the nearest building. In other words, if you're putting it in next door to a 2-story building, it couldn't be more than 4 stories high.
I think that's a good one. I like that. I like Commissioner
That way it
Overby's.
ensures that it sort of blends, that it doesn't stand out like a 7-story building next to a 1 or 2-story building would, but it allows for creeping vertical, creeping height.
That's good. Manhattan has a law. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but buildings are always built in relationship to the ones around them. That's why it has this odd dissonance that other cities don't have.
So I like that suggestion. So I want to be mindful of time too. Is that something that we're okay with, where the height, max height, could be no more than 2 stories? I think he said, can you repeat your suggestion, Commissioner Overbees?
Oh, set a maximum, something, or I don't know, an arbitrary number, 6, 7, whatever the board thinks is the right number for a limit on height, but no more than 2 stories higher than the nearest building.
Okay, so Councilman Risberger.
I like that idea. I don't know if we're going to be able to ultimately. I don't know if it'll accomplish the goal of what we're trying to get, though, Ed. Because let's say somebody does do that, and then a few years later, you have in another building, or the smaller building that's next to it, or the lot on the other side of the building, somebody else decides to come and build, but they only build a building that's maybe a story high or whatever it is. It's 4 stories smaller than the building that was built there 5 years before. Of course, it's grandfathered in. I would assume it would be, but we're still not accomplishing the look that I think we were trying to gain by putting the rule in the first place. Am I making sense?
Yes, my only comment on that would be that I don't know if it's economical to build a 1-story building downtown.
I'm just saying I wouldn't want to jump into a change. I'd want to think about a change.
So why don't we,
Maybe we could make it some kind of a guideline rather than a rule.
so why don't we start with a max height of 7, and then we'll have the other density requirement for now, and then we can come back to it.
So just for clarity, are we talking a max height of 7 in the entire MU1 zone, or are we talking about a max height of 7 in the T5 zone, which is, outside of Main Street, basically?
I thought we were talking about T6. Am I
Yeah.
way off here?
So T6 is basically the downtown historic district. That is the
Okay.
T zone. So everything on that street, you could add 2 stories to most of the buildings. What you'll hit is, I just don't know if a historic review board is going to be like, yeah, go ahead and add 2 stories to, Stevens Hardware building. I don't. So my thought was, if we did it in the T5 zone where we have vacant property, we've got, theoretically you could tear down Delaware Engineering's building and it wouldn't be a, loss architecturally, and you could build we could say, a 7-story building there. You maybe on the Betty All lot, like there's land there, we could redevelop Clinton Plaza into a 7-story building if you wanted. That would all be in that T5 zone. So, I mean,
Okay.
I'm just thinking that theoretically, we could increase the heights in that kind of Market Street zone, because that T4 zone where Kano is the transitional type. Most of that is going to be in that 3-story lower height because it's a transitional. It's directly abutted to an R2. It's directly abutted to Walnut Street. But everything on the Market side, it's directly abutted to the park and the railroad tracks. So who cares? So you could theoretically concentrate taller buildings in that area where we could still theoretically build out, where you're not restricted by the historic district. You're not restricted by, any sort of architectural value that's there. I mean, most of the buildings are mid-century, or they're a parking garage, or they're Sydney Federal, or it's the parking lot to the Clarion. You could say like that area we could theoretically build up. I don't think anyone's going to bulldoze the Oneonta Hotel to build a house or build a project. I could see someone saying it's worth it to bulldoze Carpet Plus. I mean, like, I think if you're going to see development, it would probably be on Market Street versus on Main Street. I don't think anyone's going to tear down Kano to build, a 6-story building, and I don't think we would want them to.
Can I ask a question before I go?
Just really quick, would we have a quorum if Commissioner Overby leaves?
As long as he's the
Yeah,
only
yeah.
one who leaves, yes.
Okay, just making sure. Sorry, Ed, go
I
ahead.
want to ask a question about Broadway before I go. If we approve that subdivision, do the new lots meet the setback requirements? Or does it need a variance?
The lots would meet the setback. The lots would meet the requirement, but the existing structures currently don't meet the requirements.
That's what I'm saying. Don't they need an area variance?
I mean, so the only reason that I brought this forward is in the past, these have just been, basically they've been approved if they meet the parcel size. We don't really have a very clear small subdivision ordinance. It's kind of just as long as a parcel meets the requirement. So, I mean, I don't know how we want to address this because the current condition is non-conforming. I don't know if technically by subdividing this lot, you're making it any more non-conforming. Because it already, I don't think it increases the non-conformity of the lot if it already is non-conforming in the exact same way that it is currently non-conforming.
Okay, I just wanted to raise a question.
No, yeah, and I agree. That's why it's here. I mean, in theory, I don't know if putting a line down the middle of the lot makes it more non-conforming than it already is. And that's kind of why it kind of got floated over to here.
I think, so then the question about whether or not they would be requiring a area variance would then be whether we're increasing the degree of nonconformity. And so then the question that I would have is then would we be, we had two, we'd be essentially creating two non-conforming lots, but they're the same but then of the same size as the existing one. So there'd be no change in size. It would just be in the change in number of non-conforming lots. Is that correct?
You would have two lots that have that have structures that don't conform to the setback.
So
You
yeah,
currently
right.
have two structures that don't conform to the setback. So
So yeah, so it'd be a change in 2 lots versus 2 structures, essentially.
Yeah, it's kind of a, I don't know who thought it was a good idea to build these buildings here. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who drew that map and who built those buildings, but
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. Okay, so let's touch on, so we can, are we ready to wrap up the discussion about the MU1 code, or do we want to hold it over until next month? Shane, do you have a question?
My recommendation would be in the T5, in the the T5 transect, currently as Stephen has it, it's 4 stories maximum. So, and T6 is 5 stories maximum. So my suggestion would be that maybe we change it to allow up to 6 stories in T5, which would be an additional 2, which would only, leave it at that, and just simple. That includes Market Street and parts to the north, the Deed Street lofts. And then, if I just feel like if you go to 7 or 8, then it's what I guess we don't want to see is a huge difference between Main Street and surrounding Main Street being way taller, right? I think, and I personally think the argument of having, well, if you put it, having a requirement for being next to a building, I just think that creates more questions than answers. I mean, what if it's next to one tall building, but on the other side of it is a gas station? I mean, if someone were to buy the parking lot between the hotel and the Key Bank drive-through, which building do they get to use as their argument, right? I mean, so I guess that's just my suggestion. And I think we should probably vote on it today because we've kind of held it for a while with Stephen, so.
Okay, I'm okay with 6, maximum height of 6 stories in the T5 zone. And then with that recommendation, along with our discussion about signs, passing it on to the legislative committee. With that said, I'd like to open the floor to a motion. Anybody?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second, Commissioner Thomas. Any further discussion? Hearing none, clerk, could you please call the roll?
Chair Lappin,
Yes.
Commissioner Stanton,
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
Commissioner Dygan,
Yes.
passes.
Okay, next on the agenda is 56 West Broadway. I see we have the applicant here. I apologize for keeping you waiting. Do you want to introduce yourself and explain to the commission what you're trying to do?
Hi, it's Philip Hill.
Hi, Phil. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. So why don't you tell us what you're trying to do?
I bought this property in 2004, and it is originally 56, 58, and 60 West Broadway. The property to my west is actually 62. At some point in the 30s, they built the store, which is 58 West Broadway. When I bought it, that store had been abandoned for over 20 years. It had no utilities, no water, no sewage, no electric, no gas. I had to bring all that in. At this point, 58 is a duplex. 56 is in the process of completing the conversion to a duplex, and it sits on one lot, one tax map. The difficulty is there's no comps anywhere within the prescribed area when it comes for real estate sale, for real estate refinancing, and it is blocking me from completing the exteriors, which would increase the value and look of the neighborhood. As probably a lot of you are aware, the Sixth Ward, and specifically the area where I'm located, kind of River Street, West Broadway area, a lot of the properties have been bought and are being updated. and I'm being held back from completing this by the fact there is no conforming property or comparable properties in the city.
And then, so
So
you're
I-
looking.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
So you're looking for a minor subdivision approval from this commission.
Yes, at one point, this was 2 lots. It was 2 separate properties. The property line was a bit different than what it is now, but that's because of where they built the store. The parking lot that's next to the store at one time contained a house.
Okay. And so, it seems reasonable enough, you know, and we are certainly grateful for any attempt to improve the character of the city of Oneonta and the 6th Ward. So there was some discussion about whether or not the question about increasing the nonconformity of the lot.
Can I just, Phil, do you know off the top, I didn't realize you're here, Phil. Do you know off the top of your head what how far those buildings are from your proposed lot line?
So I think there's just under 4 feet between the buildings. So it would be, 2 feet. It doesn't meet the setback, but that said, there is a large number of properties in Oneonta that don't conform with the setbacks. Existing properties on existing separate deeds and tax maps.
That is true. And so right now, I guess in my opinion, as it stands right now, Mr. Hill's proposal doesn't, in my opinion, increase the degree of nonconformity, largely because the area of the lot's not changing. And so if he were to build more and increase the size of the structure of the footprint, you probably have to go back and get an area variance. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yeah, oops. Yeah, that would be correct. I mean, any change to the physical aspect of the property would require an area variance. I guess, I mean, in theory, there would be no way to subdivide this parcel without issuing area variances for already existing nonconformities. I mean, that's kind of why it's in a weird, I mean, the whole thing's kind of weird.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't build that building today, even under the state building code, like under the fire code, because it doesn't even meet the parcel setbacks. So I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. So if we were to grant the subdivision so that he could complete the repair work on the property, if he were to do other activity on it in addition to that, he'd need a variance essentially, just largely because the way that the lot is designed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so right now, because of the way those properties are laid out, they're non-conforming. So if Phil wanted to build a deck, he has a non-conforming parcel. I mean, he's going to need an area variance or some sort of zoning approval to do anything on that house as it is now. So yeah, I mean, it's a weird one, just because whoever kind of did this in the 30s just didn't really think about what we would be doing in 2021.
Sure. So I guess if we were to think about it in terms of, the way to free up that parcel for the highest amount of development, it could be to refer this action to the ZBA for an area variance. And the reasoning being is that it looks like the, proposed action doesn't really, it looks like it meets majority, if not all of the criteria for an area variance. lar- largely because the new zoning law was the lot was drawn in the 30s. The new zoning law was adopted in 2013. And as it stands right now, the property's in a state of repair that kind of detracts from the overall character of the neighborhood, and he's trying to improve it.
So my question might be, this could be recommended to the zoning board for an area variance for the current setbacks, just to establish that the current setbacks are in fact a hardship and could be basically grandfathered in the form of an area variance. And the site and the subdivision could be approved based on that, the granting of that variance.
That sounds like a reasonable suggestion, Steve. What do you guys think?
My question is, maybe I'm just confused, but why would he need a variance if I mean, aren't they're already grandfathered in, right? They're already non-conforming uses. Why does he need a variance? He's not proposing to change the actual structure. So the subdividing, it's not going to increase or decrease the non-conformity.
So what we essentially, what I think, because it's kind of a weird parcel and a weird set of buildings, by granting an area variance, you essentially recognize that the current conditions of the property are in fact legal and would therefore be conforming to the zone. Like, you're not officially saying they're conforming, but you're basically giving them a get out of jail free card on it. You're saying that if we grant this subdivision, there's no question as to whether those setbacks are or not conforming, they become legal. So in the future, if Mr. Hill decided he wanted to, construct something that, or increase the number of units in the house, or do anything essentially that would increase the level of non-conformity that the code currently has on it, he would be free from that. So like under the code now, it says because Phil Hill's buildings don't meet the setback, if you grant a subdivision, his buildings will still not meet the setback and they will still require a zoning variance to do anything. By grandfathering the conditions of the property through an area variance, you're essentially saying in the future, if Phil Hill decides to do something, those setbacks will not be a restriction on his ability to do something. So yeah, I mean, that might be beneficial to Phil beyond just the subdivision.
Yeah, so that's kind of hence my reasoning earlier was maybe in the event to free up the property to the most, to give him the most leeway on what he wants to do. That's kind of where I was going with that.
Well, I hear that and that makes sense, but why? I guess my other question would be, why is that connected to the subdivision? Like if we can grant him a subdivision tonight, he can decide if he wants to go get an area variance. I mean, that's kind of a separate, if he wants to get an area variance, he can request one. But why is that in any way linked to us granting him a subdivision?
So the only thing I would say there is the code doesn't want us to make so the code wants the lot to be in conformity before you make a parcel. So I think you could argue this one either way. I think you could argue that you're not increasing the non-conforming condition. So it's going to be up to what you guys want to do. I don't see it as increasing a non-conformity because it's really just a line that already, I mean, it's not there right now, but it's not changing anything by adding that line. I mean, there's no substantial change to the parcel. There's no substantial change to the use. There's no change. It's just a legally binding line. So it really would come down to if you're comfortable granting a subdivision approval on something that I guess could be like, run around as like a non-conformity. So it's kind of, I think it's a 6 to 1, half dozen the other.
So then I guess we could go either way. It doesn't really matter. I guess in the question, would then be, so in the event we could recommend subdivision approval, recommend that the ZBA issue an area variance, and then conditionally approve the subdivision application based on that. That would involve going to one more meeting, or we could just approve the subdivision now. And then in the event that he decides to do something else on the property, Mr. Hill could go back to the ZBA for a variance. So what is our preference? And Mr. Hill, you can chime in on what your future plans are. Perhaps we should ask you.
Other than completing the exteriors of the property, I don't have any plans. The problem really becomes that I've spent so much money on this property to get it where it is now that I'm no longer able to continue down this path the way it sits. And at some point, this is going to become another property that is either abandoned or has some negative impact in that fashion because of the way it sits. I want to, the roof on 56 needs to be done. The exterior 56 completely needs to be done. In doing that, the front porch needs to be replaced. It's not in good shape. And the exterior, meaning the siding of 58, needs to be completed. I have no desire to change the footprint or the buildings themselves, other than the front porch, which would be just changing. It wouldn't change the footprint.
Okay, so based on what you're saying, then maybe if you just want to do the repairs and replace the porch, then we could proceed with the subdivision application, so long as we determine that we're not increasing the degree of non-conformity, but we should also, yeah. So what do we think? What do we want to? What is the preference of the commission?
Well, if he's not looking to do anything where he's gonna need the variance, then I guess we could just approve the lot line.
And so, Stephen, this would be a type 2 action, right?
Yes, I mean, again, like, we don't really, I mean, there's nothing in the code that states what this is other than, I mean, you could call it I guess you could, I mean, so type 2 actions are like, setback, lot line adjustments, like, area variances for those kind of things. I mean, in this, like, I don't know if it's really so much as a discretionary decision as it just is. I mean, he's making two lots that, meet the square footage, the site requirements for the city of Oneonta. I mean, he's not installing roads, he's not installing signs, he's basically just making two parcels that meet the minimum lot sizes.
So then,
So I don't. It's not really a site plan approval because there's no site plan application required for subdivision.
right. So, but then I guess we'd still have to use our judgment to approve, correct?
Correct.
So then it'd be a discretionary decision and subject to seeker, but it wouldn't really matter. It's a moot point, and just for procedural purposes, so it'd be a type 2. Requiring no further review.
Yeah,
So
you could also make the argument that it has, it doesn't have an impact on any environmental. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't exactly know how it specifically would be laid out. I mean, like I said, in the past, these have just been kind of administratively approved. So I don't know what process. I know they've been treated as lot line adjustments before, where we've made parcels either bigger or smaller. I think this is kind of one of those things that we should probably address, like maybe in a code update.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So you're saying in the past is basically a ministerial decision. We didn't, the
Right.
planning commission chairman just, went in and signed the plat.
Right. Correct.
Okay, so I guess maybe we'll revisit the subdivision issue. Why don't we address, subdivision approvals in the future? And why don't we go ahead and vote on the subdivision application? It seems straightforward enough.
Stephen, we don't have anything in our code for a simple lot split.
Yeah, we define that in our code, but we don't have any procedural method for it. So we have in our code like a massive thing about like street sizes and, sign locations and fire height. I mean, it's basically a subdivision law that was written for like, if you were in, like, I don't know, like maybe like outside Saratoga. It's basically designed around what appear to be like multi-parcel, large parcel, like development stuff. So we really just, the minor subdivision in our code, it's defined, but there's no process for it. So we've had a couple of these pop up in the past, and they've pretty much just turned into like an administrative review procedure to make sure that the parcel sizes were the correct size. Phil's was like kind of a weird one because of the building thing. So that kind of created like a weird hiccup in what is normally just I have a 2-acre lawn and I want to give my neighbor half of it. So those have just kind of been signed off on procedurally in the past.
So Danny, I guess we want to vote on approving this, or?
Okay, so do I have a motion to approve the subdivision application presented in front of us?
I make a motion that we approve the subdivision application.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Motion made by Commissioner Stanton, seconded by Commissioner Thomas. Any further discussion? Hearing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Chair Lappin,
Yes.
Commissioner Stanton,
Yes,
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
Commissioner Dygan.
Yes.
Passes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your assistance and your time.
Thank you for your patience. We appreciate it. So, Steve, I guess I'll come down and sign the subdivision plat then.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll do that tomorrow.
Thank
So,
you.
you're welcome. Have a good night. Does anybody have any new business to bring? No? Okay. And
Can I just throw one other thing out? Sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Steve.
I think another, just something for everyone to think about. So we have a condition like in the MU 1s, 2s, where we have a zoning ordinance that prevents more than 3 unrelated people from living in a single, like a dwelling unit. And I know this is a touchy subject, and I know I'm kind of walking a thin line here, but we have a situation where in the MU 1 and 2, you could bulldoze a single family home and you could construct a 40-unit apartment building. My question is, and this is just something to think about, do we want to review that and maybe decide like, or just think about in some of those zones where we allow for higher density uses, is that restriction on unrelated people meeting any sort of like, administrative or zoning goal? Like if we have a zone where you can tear down a 2-family home or a single family home and build a 30-unit apartment building, or you can subdivide a single family home into a 4-unit apartment building, is it a better route to allow like a large single family home in an MU 1 or 2 to be used as like more of a boarding house and less of a 2-unit if our intent is to maintain some of these buildings as single family type structures, is it beneficial to restrict their use and therefore encourage the creation of more 2-family, 3-family? It's just a thought.
I think it's beneficial to keep it the way it is, no more than 3. In a single family home, it's a matter, for one thing, it's a matter of bathrooms. If you divide a house into 4 apartments, you have 4 kitchens, 4 bathrooms. If you have a house with 1 bathroom and you have 10 people in it, that creates a slum. So I don't think we should change that.
I tend to disagree. I just think that having been a college student, I know no one even really follows those rules. So you end up having leases with 3 people on them on the lease, and then 4 or 5 people that just kind of unofficially pay. And I think that
Just from personal experience, Shane.
this is well, no statement on that, but I just think, I mean, who are we to say? I mean, yeah, I would just say, I understand that the idea behind it is probably to limit you having 10 people crowded into a house making tons of noise. I get it, but what about the case where there's just 4 people, 4 friends that want to live together in a 4-bedroom house?
Well, if
Yeah,
it's in a
so-
high density area, I can see the benefit of it. Like in MU1.
So I'm not discussing housing in the residential neighborhoods. I'm discussing so for example, there's a property on Chestnut Street. It's across from the Walgreens, maybe the Rite Aid, whatever it is that's up there. It's a big Victorian house up there on Chestnut Street.
I know the one, yeah.
Yeah, so in theory, that house, has, I don't know, what could be probably originally was 5 bedrooms. So if someone's interested in purchasing that house, they can only occupy 3 of those bedrooms. But what they could do is subdivide that house into 4 individual units. So I guess my question is, in some of our higher density zones like MU1 and 2, are we encouraging people to cut houses like that into 4-unit apartment buildings by telling them they can't use it as a 5-bedroom house? And that's my only question, is if we have buildings that were built as 5-bedroom houses that are in those higher density zones, is it beneficial to us to restrict people from using them as a 5-bedroom house in a zone where they could theoretically subdivide them into 4 units and put 12 people in them?
But if they subdivide them into 4 or 5 unit, aren't they subject to the parking rules? I mean, 2 or 3 parking spots for every.
Not if the new MU1 code doesn't establish a minimum parking requirement. They'd be
Well,
subject to market conditions. They
Yeah,
can-
and even the old code, I mean, the MU1 and 2 zones are fairly flexible. I know for short-term rental housing, it requires 1 parking spot per dwelling unit. So I mean, it's 1.2. So it's already pretty flexible, or pretty lax. So I mean, it's just the thought. I mean, I only asked because I had a woman call about that particular house. And basically what I had to tell her was the parking's available, so you could cut it into a 2 or 3 unit house. But I mean, I kind of hate to see a house like that get subdivided just so that you can put 5 people in it instead of 3. So
Right. So I think that another angle to look at it is, I was reading a report about housing in student college towns, I should say, and that the unrelated individual ordinance, can have an unintended consequence of decreasing housing affordability. And so it kind of goes back to Shane's point about multiple friends wanting to rent out a house together. or maybe multiple working professionals too. I know that if I wasn't married, or if I hadn't had someone else to share the cost of living with me, I don't think I'd be able to afford rent on my own when I first started out in Oneonta. So,
Again, this isn't, I'm not saying we should throw all this out today, like in our R1s and 2s, but I mean, we have zones where we allow higher density housing where theoretically you could take a 6-bedroom house and just cut it into 2 units and you'd be legal. So,
right.
I don't know if we're meeting the intent or accomplishing what we're trying to do.
So I guess this would be a discussion. And then also, my understanding, Stephen, is that it's very hard to enforce the unrelated individual requirement too. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that we should change stuff based on enforcement procedures. I mean, it's, it is what it is. I mean, it's hard to enforce the speeding. Cops have a hard time enforcing speeding. You find it when you find it, and every day probably 100% of the population speeds. At some point. So it's like any ordinance. I mean, we enforce it when we find it. We enforce it as well as we can. I'm just saying, like in some of these zones where all we're enforcing is people to turn houses into duplexes. I mean, is that what is that the ultimate goal? I mean, are we okay with houses being converted to duplexes? And if that's fine, that's fine.
So I guess the other thing then, the response to that question would be based on the city's housing study and the comprehensive plan. It's the city's stated goal to preserve the existing single family housing stock, I guess citywide, basically. And so I guess so in the event that, in the MU1s and 2, to address, to visit that idea of allowing more than 3 unrelated individuals to occupy a house, if we can do anything to avoid encouraging people to, chop up for our housing stock further, I think that would be preferable in my opinion.
But I mean, it's not something we have to decide tonight. I'm not saying like, guys, we need to solve the world's problems this evening. It's just kind of a general thought about, we have zones where I can sign building permits all day converting homes into 2 units that theoretically could just be a 6-bedroom house. So it's more of a philosophical question than like we have to address it this evening.
So where do you stop? You stop at 10 individuals, 20 in a house?
No,
50?
the state fire code says how many square feet you have to have for a bedroom, how many people have to share a bathroom, how many. So I mean,
there you go.
Theoretically, if I built a 6-bedroom house, and most of these houses meet, I have a house that you could put 4 bedrooms into, and it would be fine. I mean, so we know that houses exist that have 6 bedrooms, but we say only 3 people can live there. So we mandate that only 3 people that can live there. So the landlord says, well, okay, I'll just make two 3-bedroom apartments. So then they subdivide the house into a 2 unit so that they can have 6 occupants in the building. So my only question is, if you can do that, if you can subdivide a house into a 2 unit in order to put 6 people in it, are we really meeting our intent, which is to preserve single family housing stock, or are we just creating duplexes?
Yeah, you got a good point there. But maybe we should modify the code a little bit and say, well, you can have 1 person for every bedroom.
Yeah, I think that I think one of the things that is positive about having being planning commissioners is that we can revisit sections of the code that we think should be revised. I think Stephen brings up a good point. So why don't we for the next next month is the fraternities and sororities, and that might, depending on I'm sure that we'll all have lots of questions about that. But if we have time, we can revisit this in May, and if not, we can probably have a more thorough discussion in June. And I'm sure by then the legislative committee will have discussed the MU1 code, so we can probably have a much more involved discussion then too. What do you
Can I
think?
just ask you a question, Danny? Quick
Sure.
for Stephen. Stephen, for the MU1 zone specifically, if adopted as it exists right now, we're basically removing that requirement for the MU1 zone, right?
No, because we have an overarching ordinance for
okay.
the entire zoning system that restricts three unrelated.
Okay, okay, gotcha.
So my question basically is, as we're updating this code, does it make sense to say, you know what, in MU1s and 2s, like in higher density locations, are we accomplishing anything by limiting the number of people that can live in a building? If you can bulldoze a building and build a 6-unit house, or if you can take a house and subdivide it 4 ways, what does it matter that you can only have 3 unrelated people live in a single family home?
Danny, could we maybe put this on the next meeting's agenda to make sure we talk about it?
Sure. Yeah, why don't we table this and hold it over until the May agenda if we have time to discuss it, and then if we need further discussion, we have the June meeting as well. So, all right. Is there any other new business? No. Hearing none. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.
You too.